especially for fiction writers, you've written your book and you might be thinking about podcast guesting. And as a new podcast guest, you might think that the idea is to go on there and tell people the plot of your book, which is not what we recommend. Thinking through and having ready to hand those stories behind the pages, the story behind the story that you can share with people. So giving yourself time to come up with what you want to share. And you can do that by, for example, getting together with a friend who is a fan of your work, a fan of your genre, or a fan of your nonfiction expertise area, and just talking through it with them over coffee. And watching where their eyes light up or they lean forward, and watching where maybe they start glancing around or seem like a little like they're tuning out a little bit. And then that gives you really clear ideas for, I need to really lean into this part of it. I need to not lean into this other part of it.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 440 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. Today's episode, I have a conversation with Matty Dalrymple. Matty Dalrymple educates writers as the indie author. She also hosts the Indie Author podcast and serves as the campaign manager for the Alliance of Independent Authors. And if all that's not enough, she is the author of the Anne Kinnear suspense novels and Lizzie Ballard thrillers. Now, this episode is an interview Matty and I did back in June of this year, 2025, and it was a conversation behind the scenes of the Podcast Guest Playbook that I co-authored with Matty. Now, because I'm so far behind in some of the episodes I had done in the past, I am only getting to this episode now, and of course, Matty and I just released the second edition of another co-authored book of ours from a few years back, taking the short tack about short fiction. There'll be more about that coming up later. But even though we just recently released the second edition of that short tack book, this is a book all about being a podcast guest. Being a podcast guest on my podcast or Matty's podcast, or one of a plethora of the thousands of other podcasts out there. And our guidebook is meant to help authors understand how they can get into the right frame, the mindset, what it is, why they may want to do it, some of the benefits, some of the perks, as well as some of the strategies that are going to work for you. And Matty and I talk through sort of the behind the scenes about this book as well. And that's coming up later in this episode. But first, let's hear a word about this episode's sponsor. This episode is sponsored by ManuscriptReport.com. Make your book impossible to ignore. Stop guessing what works. Ethical AI for book marketing and advertising with personalized blurbs, scroll-stopping social media content, comp titles and authors, detailed target audience, and more. This is analytical AI geared towards helping you with marketing your books. You load your manuscript in PDF format, you pay the fee, and usually within half an hour, you've got that 26 page report sent to you that has your book positioning, comparative titles, SEO keywords, the tropes, themes, genres, and marketing copy that you can use to help push and market your book to the right audiences. And if you want to save $5 off Manuscript Report, you can use the code MARK5, that's MARK5, at checkout. Again, making your book impossible to ignore by help with targeting it to the right audience based specifically on your book's content. Again, manuscriptreport.com, use MARK5 at checkout to save $5 off. And comments from recent episodes. So over on Spotify, I've got a comment from Sylvie Soulier, who says, this is in reference to episode 439, all about CanCon, which is both the conference I was going to last week, as well as the Canadian content regulations we have here. Sylvie says, so I bet you croon The Littlest Hobo at all the karaoke bars. She has a laugh emoji and says, American living in Canada here. As a child, I grew up in Michigan, grew up on a lot of CBC content. So Fred Penner, Mr. Dress Up, Under the Umbrella Tree. Katie and Orby was a darling show I woke up to every morning for school. CanCon absolutely must be championed, especially in our current climate. Great episode. Thank you so much for that, Sylvie. That's awesome. It's funny. Yeah, I guess if you're living close to the border, you were picking up some of that content as well. So you got to benefit from, Mr. Dress Up as well, which is one of the ones I did regularly watch from that list. But The Littlest Hobo, no, I have never sung that at karaoke bar. I don't even know if, I think it's called Maybe Tomorrow is the name of the song. I don't even know if it would be available. I mean, often, and this happens a lot because I do when I do karaoke, I'm often in the U.S. And so when I ask for David Wilcox, for example, David Wilcox is a Canadian performer, jazz and blues and rock, sort of a medley of those. But there is another David Wilcox who does blues in the States, a completely different David Wilcox, and they usually don't have my David Wilcox. So they don't have songs like, I think... Riverboat Fantasy is probably one of the most popular ones here that a lot of people know. So I usually don't do that. So I don't know if they would even have Maybe Tomorrow, but I'm going to check next time I'm in karaoke land as well. So I haven't done it, but thank you so much for the idea. And thank you so much for the comment. It's so funny. I didn't even realize that there were comments or I forgot that there were comments over on Spotify, because usually I try to check to see where I'm going to pick up comments from. But I want to thank you, Sylvie, for your comments. And I love getting feedback from folks of what you're thinking about, what you're reflecting on as you're listening to the episode. And I was glad to hear that episode, me just in the car on my way to CanCon. And it's funny, I did bump into a few people at CanCon who specifically mentioned listen to your podcast, and it was kind of cool to hear you talk about CanCon on the way to CanCon as well. So it's rare to get that feedback in person, but always so satisfying and makes me feel amazing to know that I'm kickstarting some stuff in your brains, as well as knowing that people are listening, but also knowing what you're thinking about. And thank you for those comments. I'm now going to play a quick bumper and get on to personal update. So, personal update. Did I mention last week that I actually released a new book, The Book of Puns? I think I mentioned it. The book is called, I think it's A Sign That the Pun Also Rises. And I launched that last week at the same time I launched that other book with Matty about short fiction. So that's been going on. And now that those projects are out of the way, I now realize, okay, now I'm under the gun to get my book of ghost stories of the Great Lakes done. Because it's kind of funny. For some reason in my head, I had December 19th. So it's kind of like, I have like all of November and a little bit of October and a little bit of December to get it. And I double checked my contract with the publisher. And I have to get that on or before December 1st. So the deadline is looming. And now my ADH brain is kicking in saying, deadline, you're going to get caught as a fraud. They're going to find out you don't know what you're doing and you're making it all up as you go along. Here comes the deadline. Here comes the pressure to get this book done. And a cool thing that happened, and this happened on the drive to CanCon last week, is over the last year almost, as I was putting together this book and ideas for the book and notes and purchasing materials and archiving bits of research and going to different locations, I've got all these bullet point notes and scraps of paper, etc. I wasn't sure how I was going to approach the book. I mean, the one thing I know is I know that Noelle, the publisher, doesn't want it to be, I have a ghost story about Hamilton, and Hamilton is on the Great Lake. So it doesn't have to be, it needs to be associated specifically with the water, right? Because there's so many stories that are landlocked, but these ones some of them may occur on land. So there's lighthouses and other stories that are very much related to a ship, and like for example, one of them that I've got in the batch is, it's a ghost of a woman of a building that was on the shore, and she's often still seen waiting for that sailor lover of hers who never came home. So it is connected specifically to the water and a missing sailor. So I will make those exceptions and do some landlocked stories, but most of them are going to be ghost stories that are really tied specifically to the lake, not being lake adjacent so much. Anyways, that I'd figured out in discussions with Noelle, but I hadn't figured out until I was on this drive, and it was just in silence and paying attention to the rhythm of the highway, etc. I was not listening to an audiobook. I was not recording. And I think that's when the idea kind of came to me, and I'm like, I think I know how I'm going to approach this book. And I find that sometimes giving yourself space, having the stuff there, and then it just kind of comes to the surface at the right time. I think I made a quick note. I either jotted it down with a pencil on a piece of paper that was in the car, or I don't think I did an audio note. Sometimes I'll do audio notes to myself as well, with the same tool, the same audio transcription or whatever, not transcription, but the same audio recorder that I used for the podcast. But that's coming together. I'm on deadline for that. I've got a whole bunch of things coming up. So this week, I've still got my Police Academy Thursday night, which is tonight as I record this, and it's almost done. There's just a few more weeks left, and I'm gonna miss 1.5 coming up, because at the beginning of November I'm gonna be in Vegas at Author Nation, so I will be missing that one. But there's so much going on, and I'm trying to coordinate where I need to be, what table I need to be at, what gathering I need to go to, what dinner I'm going to go to. And the sad news is, it's good news, I guess, is I've been invited to so many different dinners and lunches and stuff, and I was like, I wish I can be at all of them. So trying to figure all that out is challenging. But then also, so the evenings and stuff like that, getting back, I get back, and on the red eye on Friday night overnight to Saturday, hoping I can at least get some sleep on the plane, because I think I've got something going on late that afternoon on Saturday. But I also have on Sunday a play from Penny and Pound Theatre, a local theatre company. It's called Bloody Good. It's a musical, and it's about female serial killers through history. And the premise is they're all in hell, and there's a conversation between them. And I got to write some monologues for 2 of them. And I get to see that. And it's the last day of the show. It's only going to be on for 4 or 5 days, but it launches when I'm in Vegas. But I'll be able to catch the last Sunday matinee when I get back. So that's kind of cool. But just coming up this week is I have on Saturday, October 25th, I am doing the Ancaster Halloween Market, where I have a 10-foot booth sort of table. It's a 10-foot booth where I can put multiple tables. I'll be there all day in Ancaster, Ontario, selling obviously a lot of my Halloween stuff. And then on the Sunday, on the 26th, I'm going to be in Welland, Ontario at the Coles Seagate Mall in Welland. I'm so excited because they have the original Coles, the Book People logo. And in my author newsletter that I sent out, I went into nostalgia mode, because Coles, the Book People, was the place where I first worked in Ottawa on Spark Street, and I got all nostalgic about how much it's going to be so exciting. It's like a homecoming coming to Coles. Now, I've done Coles events over the years, but I haven't seen one that still has that original 90s era, 80s, 90s era logo of Coles, the Book People. Most of them have a more modernized version that's in line with the Indigo brand. Indigo now owns Coles. But so that was kind of cool. And I got such amazing feedback from people who shared their own love of bookstores that they loved or they fell in love with or whatever, or even just the nostalgia, and even some Coles stories from some other Canadian book nerds and authors that I know as well. So that was really cool. But it was also a reminder that it's been a long time since I have put out a newsletter associated with the writing and publishing business, and I've been lax in that. So I am hoping to, basically what I like to do is I like to take something from a podcast discussion and reflect on that and send that out in the newsletter. So if you're also a subscriber to that, you'll get a to catch up on that. I have links to recent episodes, etc., because I figure it's meant for this audience of writers as well. But lots going on. I don't have a lot of time to get this edited, but I believe I will get this out before midnight on Friday, as opposed to lately where I've been getting them out later on Friday, so it's not there at 12:01 a.m. As I like to have it available. But again, I have not yet missed an episode. 440 episodes. I have not missed a single Friday, and I have in fact inserted a few extra bonus episodes. And I can tell you there will be even more bonus episodes coming up because I do have to play catch up. And I've got some great interviews already recorded, and it's like this one's from June, so I really would like to be a little bit more prominent, which means sometimes slipping in those extra episodes between Fridays. But that's it for my long rambling introduction. Why don't I roll this bumper and then we can listen to this conversation that I had back in June with Matty Dalrymple as we dig into behind the scenes of the Podcast Guest Playbook. Hey, Matty, welcome back to the Stark Reflections podcast.
It is always lovely to chat with you, Mark.
Always a good time. I haven't even counted how many times you've been on the podcast, but that's not what this is about. This episode is about a book that you just released and with some bald Canadian guy.
Yes, I love working with bald Canadian guys.
The Podcast Guest Playbook. Now, before we get into the book, and we're going to talk a little bit about why this book is important, etc., I'm going to leverage a tactic that you've used on your podcast, and I did not warn you about this, but I figured perhaps you might be ready about this. Longtime listeners know who Matty Dalrymple is, but I bet you they don't know something unique about you that you'd be willing to share with the audience here, as I spring it on you.
I know. Well, I was desperately trying to think. When he started that sentence, I thought, oh, I know what's coming. And I was desperately trying to think about something that could possibly tie into the topic of podcast guesting. And I'm coming up blank on that front. Maybe I'll think of something later and I'll be able to pop
Well,
it
you
in
can always
for
add it in later as a post note.
But so I'll share the fact that I was well on my way to getting my private pilot's license once, years and years ago. Decade ago at this point, I was taking flying lessons. My husband, as you know, is a pilot, and I went on what is called a pinch hitter course, which is basically intended to train a non-pilot passenger to land a plane in case of an emergency. And as I think happens to a lot of people who take that course, I got hooked. I continued taking lessons, and then if anyone ever has like hours at a bar sometime at a writer's conference and wants to hear the entire gruesome story of my piloting experience, I can share that. But the short version is that just as I was coming up to the time when I would be doing my solo, The Sense of Death came out, my first Ann Kinnear suspense novel. I was working on The Sense of Reckoning, which is the second novel. And I just decided that because I was holding a full-time job at the time, I needed to stop doing something. And what I decided to stop doing was my flying lessons. But I am a huge aviation nerd, and I've been able to work aviation into several of my novels, one of which is the third Ann Kinnear suspense novel, The Falcon and the Owl. And I am also working on a standalone right now that also has an aviation theme.
Wow. So it's aviation and nautical. You've got all of these themes going on in the books. And
lots
I
of
know
forms of transportation.
Anyone who has co-authored with you understands the term "you have the plane" or "you have the manuscript."
Yes, that is very important. That was a theory that Michael Aran and I came up with for our first co-authored book that you and I used for ours, which is a very intentional passing of control of the manuscript from one co-author to the other, which I based on "you have the plane" is the terminology you would use if you were flying with someone.
That's awesome. I love that so much. Okay, so you have run the Indie Author podcast for how many years now?
It started in 2016, very infrequently. It was very sporadic at first. I went on a regular schedule in 2020 and then or in 2019, and then in 2020 I went weekly. I think that was the schedule.
Okay. And then obviously I have a podcast, which is very obvious because anyone listening to this would understand that I have a podcast. So that talk about redundant. But why? Why? And I think we talked about this after having lunch in Author Nation in Vegas in November. You and Wade and I were having a lovely lunch together.
Yeah,
I think I was able to eat solid food again for the first time in days.
I do remember that.
And
Yes, it was a big day for all of
and
us.
and you said, "Hey, I have this idea." So why? Where'd this idea come from for writing a book for people who are thinking about being guests on podcasts?
Well, I had written about podcast hosting in the Indie Author's Guide to Podcasting for Authors. And I think there were two things that led to the podcast guesting book. One is that as a result of having written the podcast hosting book, I was getting speaking engagements to talk about that topic. And when was preparing those presentations, I thought, well, there's definitely going to be a group of people in those presentations that definitely are interested in hosting. But my speculation was that hosting was not going to appeal to everybody, and I wanted to offer something that would be more generally applicable to the audience that attended. And so I started adding in information from a guesting point of view as well as a hosting point of view in those presentations. Um, as I uh, hosted guest after guest after guest of the Indie Author Podcast. And maybe by the time this goes out, I will have hosted landmark episode 300 with you. You're kind enough to join me at all my century mark uh, episodes. So, I had a lot of experience, most of those with people who were very familiar with podcasting, who were real pros that I gained tips from and kind of made little mental notes to myself about. And then sometimes I would interview someone who if this was very new to. And I would get done with that interview and I would think, oh, if only they had had these couple of tips that they could have followed, it would have been a better experience all around. And so I started collecting those sort of into the skeleton of what became the Podcast Guest Playbook. And then when you and I spoke at Author Nation, I realized that what I was sort of missing were the in-depth illustrative stories that I think really bring those tips to life. And I was very grateful when you offered to join me on that venture and provide some of those personal examples, as well as just your tips on other areas like radio interviews, which is something that I haven't really ventured into.
I love that how projects like that come together because it's like, yeah, that's a great idea. And we hadn't co-authored since taking the short tack.
Yep.
So it had been I don't know how many years, several years. It's been out for a few years now.
Yeah, I think that was in 2020.
Oh, wow. So 5 years later.
Yeah.
But I love sharing insights with listeners into some of the behind the scenes of putting the book together.
Yeah.
And the title and the subtitle itself, we had a bit of a back and forth on, right? Because we wanted it
Yeah.
to be for authors, but then also like the other people want to be podcast guests, too, right? So
Yeah.
you want to talk a little bit about that sort of back and forth and how we landed on the title and the subtitle. But first, could you please read the title and the
Yes.
subtitle so that the
The
listeners they may not have seen that visual of you
they
holding
have
up
it
the
in their
book.
head for people who are watching, if anybody's ever watching the Podcast Guest Playbook, turning conversations into connections and community. And
Those
we
three
land
C's.
the three C's. It works out serendipitously that oftentimes these kinds of words come in these kind of alliterative sets. And I think we came to connections and community pretty early. Connections and community are definitely a theme. I think if you look at most of the subtitles of most of my nonfiction books,
Yeah,
it's about connections and community. We played briefly with the idea of cash as
yeah,
to highlight the ways that authors can earn cash from their podcast appearances indirectly, not
yeah,
directly, and
yeah.
decided that that was a little bit smarmy sounding. And but then that idea that the conversations are really the foundational part of it, that if you can make it a conversation with your host and by extension with the people who are listening, then the community that you can build among readers for your books is available. And but then I think maybe even more importantly, the connections you build with your host, and maybe we can share some stories about how we've benefited from that. Those connections can pay off dividends long, long after the record light has gone off or the live light has gone off, and that's something that we wanted to make sure people understood the value of.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of connections, it was so funny. when we were both at the American Library Association conference in Philadelphia recently, and I had an author come up to me and say, "I've met you before. I think I know you from somewhere." And kept saying that, and I was kind of like, well, I've never been to this conference before. I don't remember us interacting before, but it came down that she had heard me on the Creative Pen podcast, and I think also the Indie Author podcast. And
Yay!
so I had a connection, right, as a guest on two esteemed podcasts for authors, for indie authors in particular. And I had a connection with this person who had a connection with me and thought that we had met because she'd heard my voice before. And I
Yeah,
was like, that is an example of powerful connection in my mind, and a recent one too, just from last week.
yeah. Yeah, early on, very early on in my indie author career, I was doing a presentation that really, if you boiled it down, it was about the importance of connections. And I started putting together like a chart that would show, like, I met Mark, and then through Mark, I met this person, and then through that person, I met this person. And this opened up this opportunity, this book co-authoring opportunity, or this speaking opportunity, or whatever. And that was years and years and years ago, and it very quickly became way too complicated um, to present in like a slide. And I kind of wish I had continued it because just the very complexity of it would have illustrated the point that each of
Yeah.
those connections you form, if it's mutually beneficial, and I think that's another important point we make in the book, you want this to be not a one-way, you're not just looking for favors from the host. This needs to be a two-way benefit, a mutual benefit, um, that that the complexity of that would have illustrated all the benefits you can gain from nurturing those connections.
And I love that. I think there used to be some sort of web device where you could look at one of your books, and it was based on the Amazon ecosystem, and you could see how it was connected to other books because it
Yeah,
was drawing that from the data. And do you remember
yeah.
that? And you would zoom
I
in
don't
and
think I
see
ever
the
saw that. No.
it was early on. It was
Yeah.
probably a good 10, 12 years ago
Okay.
that I remember. You could take a book, and it was based on like the also bots and the various algorithms that were drawn from Amazon. It was like a visual representation of your books and how they're connected to one another based on reader connections.
Yeah.
And I would just I'm reminded I'm imagining the same thing with Maddie's face and Mark's face and Joanna's face
Yeah.
and Michael's face and all these zooming in and out and see the connections that we all have. But I mean that's a I think that's a really powerful indicator of just that. Well, there's layers of community too, because so you and I know a lot of folks in the indie author community from various platforms, right? From our podcasts, from the Alliance of Independent Authors, from other elements. But then when I was at the show, again, I'm going to go back to the American Library Association because I think that connection's important. I knew you, but we both knew people at IBPA, and you were there doing signing books at the Independent Book Publishers Association, which is a U.S. association. Now, which reminded me that I'd been talking not just to Andrea, but to previous heads of IBPA for over 10 years. And it was a reminder to me of, I wonder if I should be a member of this association because I like being members of associations like the Alliance of Independent Authors, IBPA, et cetera, that provide value for the community that we believe in. But then I also saw Dustin, who was a former winner of Writers of the Future, and that's someone I know from a different community because it's more like the traditional publishing realm where I happen to be a judge. And so right there, the three of us, were connected. But then there were other people who came by that either you knew from one community and I didn't know, or I knew from a different community. And it's just, and we were both in. I had been to Book Expo America for years and years. I'd gone to that as a bookseller, as somebody who worked at Kobo and then Drafted Digital over the years until BEA died a slow, horribly slow, agonizing, painful death caused by, I guess, bleeding the publishers dry for charging too much money and nobody could afford to go. But ALA, the American Library Association conference, was as huge as BEA was in the heyday. Meaning it was so big that one of my biggest challenges was giving away free books which I thought is a weird challenge to have because there's so many free books to be had.
Yeah, by the time you get to your booth, they already have 45 pounds of books.
Yeah,
So,
and they're
yeah.
like, well, I don't want another book. It was like, what? But this is the audience. So that was it. That was new for you, right? The ALA. Had you ever gone to one of those before?
No, I had not. I ended up going this year because it was a 1 hour train trip for me from my home outside Philadelphia. And it was really fantastic. And I think all those examples you're giving about you introduced me to Justin, and then we realized we knew some of the same people and some of the different people, that kind of matchmaker role. I think people understand that that is a benefit of being a host. You get this network of other people in your area, but I think that sometimes people underestimate how a podcast guest, can act in that same matchmaker position. And so, for example, I was I was recently on Joe Penn's podcast, The Creative Pen, and we got talking about Damon Courtney of Book Funnel as a
Yes.
great uh, podcast guest, and we were talking about it in the context of you don't want to be a salesperson. And if you invite Damon on, if when I, as a podcast host, have invited Damon on my podcast, he has shared loads and loads of information that is valuable to anybody, regardless of whether they're using Damon's product book funnel or not. And so I was using him as an example of what you should do. Be like Damon, be prepared to mention your product or your book or whatever it is at the end of the interview, but you're there to provide value. And so Joe and I were waxing favorably about Damon, and then when the episode aired, I sent a link to Damon, and I said, uh, Damon, I just wanted to let you know that Joe Penn and I were saying lots of nice things about you on the Creative Pen podcast, and I just got an email back from him saying I'm blushing.
Hard to
But
make Damon blush.
yes, well, evidently I succeeded in doing so. And
There
I
you
think
go.
that that's that exactly that kind of network of connections that you can build that you're talking about, and ALA was an example of, generalizes to podcast guesting too, because there I was a guest on Joe's podcast, and yet I was able to, not only do something nice for Damon, but selfishly, like, put myself on Damon's radar again. I haven't talked to Damon for months, and so it
Yeah.
was nice to just say, hey, I'm
Well,
out here
but
and I'm
you were
saying nice
doing
things
it
about you.
by using Damon as an example of a really great podcast guest.
Yes,
And also you were pushing him up. You were
yes,
propping him up. You were supporting him.
exactly.
And so I want to get to sort of that sort of element. But this is the other thing is I think one of the biggest issues a lot of authors seem to face is they think by coming on my podcast, they're going to sell a whole bunch of books. I mean, yes, potentially, if their books are for writers, there's a chance that the audience is in line because they're the target audience for that. But I I want to be frank. I want to be honest. I want to be stark with them in terms of saying we're going to have a great conversation. People are going to you get some like what's the value you can offer to the author community, but I wouldn't count on book sales from it. Now that just seems counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Well, I think that it's the idea of the long tail. So I don't know that I've ever, maybe with a couple of exceptions, I've never done a podcast and then been able to look at my sales numbers for books and seen like a dramatic spike as a result of
Right.
that. But I think that the benefits are long term. One of which is that it opens up other opportunities. And so if I approach an event organizer and I want to pitch myself as a speaker on the topic of podcast guesting, then I love to be able to provide a bunch of links to interviews I've done about podcast guesting so that they can see that, yes, I really do know what I'm talking about. If it's a virtual event, I can, operate effectively in a virtual environment. And so I think those indirect opportunities are more valuable than a sudden spike in book sales. Also, one of the pieces of advice we give is that in general, podcast interviews, well, depending on your topic, podcast interviews can be evergreen. And so I don't think that our advice about podcast guesting is going to change much over the next year or 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. And so we can continue using outtakes, for example, of our interviews. In a year, I'm probably going to be putting up outtakes of conversations you and I have had in other forums about podcast guesting and say, oh, just to remind you, the Podcast Guest Playbook is out there. And
Yeah.
so you need to be looking for those long-term benefits, not the sudden spike benefits.
No, and I agree with you so much because, I mean, it again, it comes down to the connections and the connection that you make, and then even thinking about something because you may hear Maddie on this podcast talking about the Podcast Guest Playbook, and you haven't yet ever been on a podcast nor desired to be on one. But a year from now, 2 years from now, the opportunity comes up.
Yeah.
Somebody invites you to be on a podcast, and you're like, "Oh, I've never thought about that before," or whatever. It's like, did I not have this memory of hearing about this author talking about podcast guesting? And then obviously they'll probably, if they do some searching, they'll find the Stark Reflections podcast. They'll find your own podcast where you had me on as a guest. They'll
Yeah,
find the Creative Pen podcast we're trying to talk to you. There's SEO out there
exactly.
that could basically inspire them to go, "Ooh, I'm gonna listen to the podcast again, get some value," because again, each of those interviews brings different circumstances, conversations, and value that come at that topic from different angles, which we talk about in the book.
Yep.
But then that may also lead them to say, "Oh, I'm going to check out the book as well because I think it's time for me." So that leads to sort of the next question I have. So advice for authors who have never been a podcast guest. And I've recently interviewed a few people where they've said, "Oh my God, this is the first time I've ever been a guest on a podcast." And I, as a host, feel honored. But I also feel like that's a huge responsibility. It's like, oh, I want to ease them into this world. I don't want to, scare them too much. I want them to be comfortable. Any tips for those new time authors who've never been a guest on a podcast? Some things that they may want to consider.
Yeah, I would have a couple of free options and then a paid option that I'll mention. But one is, first of all, I think you need to be an enthusiastic podcast listener because I think that people are better at providing content in forms that they're familiar with as a consumer of the content. If you're providing the content, if if you yourself are a podcast listener, you kind of understand the gestalt, you understand the conventions, you kind of understand how these things work, what the expectations are, and so on. And so I'd say that would be the first thing. And the second thing is to, well, I guess one thing is to feel comfortable talking about your topic, not just writing about it. And this goes for fiction or nonfiction. You should be able to, somebody should be able to shake you up awake in the middle of the night and say, Matty, talk about, a connection building through podcast guesting. And I can talk freely about that because I've thought through it carefully in the book. And I've thought through how I want to share that information with people. Thinking of different angles, uh, especially for fiction writers, you've written your book and you might be thinking about podcast guesting. And as a new podcast guest, you might think that the idea is to go on there and tell people the plot of your book, which is not what we recommend. Thinking through and having ready to hand those stories behind the pages, the story behind the story that you can share with people. So giving yourself time to come up with what you want to share. And you can do that by, for example, getting together with a friend who is a fan of your work, a fan of your genre, or a fan of your nonfiction expertise area, and just talking through it with them over coffee and watching where like their eyes light up or they lean forward and watching where maybe they start glancing around or seem like a little like they're like, tuning out a little bit. And then that gives you really clear ideas for, oh, I need to really lean into this part of it. I need to not lean into this other part of it. And then I had exactly the experience that you had where I was interviewing people for a video segment I used to do called What I Learned. And I would ask authors two questions related to their latest book. What did they learn that they would like to share with their fellow writers? And what did they learn that they would like to share with their fellow readers? And that series got known among a couple of PR groups. And so PR firms were sending me proposals for their authors, some of whom I interviewed. And then a couple of them came back and said, oh, that was my client's first interview. And they feel much more comfortable now. Like now they've done it once, they have some experience under their belt. They're feeling much better about future interviews. And so sort of as a result of that, I started a service called Pod Pro Author Coaching, where I do that exact thing. I interview people for 5 to 10 minutes about those two topics, what they learned from their latest book. I give them both raw and edited versions of the video of that so that they can use that for promotionally if they want to do that. And then I give them a summary broken out into areas like um, technical and content and persona and branding and things like that. And so I think that that's just a nice, like the last step before you then start pitching, because you can go in there, for example, sharing that video. And I'm not suggesting that people pretend that it was an actual podcast interview, but you share that video and you can say, hey, look, it's clear. I'm comfortable on audio. I'm comfortable in video. I'm comfortable talking about my topic. So those are some of the suggestions I would have for like smoothing the way to those first engagements.
So let's dig into this offer that you do for authors. What I mean, it's a relatively short interview, sort of a warm up thing, and it's
Yeah.
edited to obviously make them look great.
Yep.
What's the price on something like that?
Thank you for asking that question. So the price for that is 125, and that includes the two sessions. We have the recording session, and then about a week later, we have the follow-up session where I go over the input I have, both pro and con, like
So,
what did
so
you do great
what
that
you
you want
give
to
them like
continue to do?
coaching tips, like here's something
Yes,
that really worked well. Here's something you might want to
yes.
consider. Okay, cool.
Exactly. Yeah. And so they leave with a very concrete set of things to do. And I think just as important, they hear what they did well, because I
Right.
think sometimes with those kinds of coaching sessions, you only hear what you need to change. And I think it's always important. Like you don't want someone to have done something really well and you don't mention it and then they don't
Yeah.
value it, so they stop doing it. So I
Right.
like telling people what they need to continue to do as well.
Oh, awesome. I love that. So I'm putting you on the spot here, but I would love to, I love offering extras to my patrons who support this podcast. And so if I pay for a session, would you be willing to do that for one of my patrons? I can
Absolutely.
pre-schedule something. Of course, it's random draw, et cetera, et cetera.
I would be happy to do that. And Mark, you've been such a supportive person. I'm happy to not have you even pay for it. But if you'd like to draw the name of one patron, I would be happy to
Oh,
provide them
well,
with a
thank
copy.
you. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Thank you for that generosity. I really appreciate that. So, yeah, I'll just probably prior to this episode going live or as it goes live, I'll have that offer to my patrons and you can indicate your interest and I'll set you up with this awesome, amazing coach who's going
That would be
to give
great.
you some valuable advice that's going to take you to that whole next level of your podcasting greatness. All right, so we're talking about greatness. We're talking about some tips for beginning authors. I'm curious to share what are there any examples or horror stories of as a podcast host of something that you wish authors didn't do, or you're like, oh, before you do this, consider the impact of the ramifications. So the horror stories, in other words.
Well, the horror story I like to share in this circumstance is in my almost 300 episodes of the Indie Author Podcast, I have only ever recorded and then not aired an interview like maybe two or three times. And one of those was because the person just used it as an infomercial. And um, this person had a product to offer, and they were they were giving the pitch for it. And I kept trying to steer the conversation away from their product to a more general conversation about the topic. And, let's make Damon blush some more. But one of the things that I loved about having a Damon as a guest on the podcast is he has every reason in the world to pitch Book Funnel. But the rule is, and Damon was a great example of this, that podcast guests on the Indie Author Podcast have to share information that is going to be valuable to the listeners, whether or not they use the product that is available. And so Damon shared great information about cross promotion and things like that. And then at the end, he had an opportunity to describe how BookFunnel enabled writers to do that more easily. But this person was just selling, selling, selling. And then you could tell that if I asked her, well, like talk more about how somebody uh, can capitalize on that opportunity or can excel in this area, and she would very intentionally not give any information. I think on the theory that, oh, well, if I give this tidbit of information, then it's one less reason for the person to buy my book or service or whatever it was. And so one is don't make it a sales pitch. We talk a lot in our book about how you need to go into it with a service mindset, not a sales mindset. You need to be thinking about how you can serve the host and their listeners. And that the second part of that is you could read your entire book in a podcast interview if there were podcast interviews that were like 8 hours long, and people would still buy your book.
Yes.
People are going to buy it because they like absorbing that kind of information in book form, because they want to remind themselves about things. They might be buying it as a thank you to you for sharing that information. But writers should never be salesy. That's my horror story. Learning that never be salesy, always bring a service mindset, and never worry about the fact that sharing information in a podcast interview will deter people from buying your book. That is not the case.
So true. So true indeed. And, particularly, I think about authors I know who are, national best-selling authors who, in many cases, have given away their entire book in audio for free.
Yeah.
And that's led to actually selling physical copies because someone listens to it and then says, "Oh, I want to buy a copy for a friend of mine,"
Yeah.
or whatever, or or get a signed copy because
Yep.
that's my nerdy thing to do is have signed copies of books that I've already read, but
Yeah.
now I have a trophy on my wall
Yeah,
to show
exactly.
off. Yeah, to show off to the world. So, all right. As we're getting close to wrapping up, let's say somebody is interested in pitching you to be on the Indie Author podcast. What's one or two things that you would like? I think you already mentioned that sort of the rule is, but is there anything more that you'd be interested in having on your podcast that you haven't yet had the pleasure of sharing? Topics or themes or whatever.
Yeah, well, I'm actually I wouldn't suggest that people pitch me immediately because I am booked up quite far in advance. And people can go to theindieauthor.com and then go to the About and Contact tab. And I always keep a post there about whether or not I'm accepting pitches.
Okay.
But in general, for me, and I think this is probably true of other people, I'm rarely in a situation where I'm saying, I really want to talk to somebody about such and such. Now I'm going to go look for an expert on that topic. It's almost always that I encounter someone serendipitously and they have a really interesting perspective to share that's in line with what I talk about on the Indie Author podcast. And I invite them because of what they have to share at that moment, not because I'm going out and looking for someone. So for me, and I imagine for other podcast hosts, it's not as important to pitch a particular topic as long as that topic is serving the the audience that the podcast is appealing to. And so I get lots and lots of pitches that are, I have a new book, can I come on your podcast and talk about it? I'm like, no, because it's not really that kind of podcast. It is very explicitly a podcast that is tapping into people who are experts in the writing and publishing worlds, who have demonstrated their expertise in areas beyond their own book. Now, there are podcasts who do I've just written a book, can I come on your podcast and talk about it thing? They're like book tour podcasts. And so definitely pitch them, but don't pitch podcasts where that isn't the emphasis.
Yeah.
And for the pitches I get, I value short and to the point. I value links. So I've gotten some podcast pitches that were very compelling sounding, but it was up to me to go search for information about who is this person? What is their topic? Have they ever talked about it before? Do they have a book about it? Whereas you can address all those very quickly with just some links in the pitch letter. No generic pitches, no sir, dear sir, madam. And also, to the extent that it's true, illustrate your familiarity with a podcast. So I do, and there are two flavors of this. Joe and I talked about this on the Creative Pen podcast. There's the clearly, I've just plugged in the name of your last podcast episode. Dear Matty, I really enjoyed your podcast episode on fill in the blank, which isn't very compelling. But I've also gotten pitches that say, I see that back in, a year ago, you talked with so-and-so about this topic. Now that years gone by, I think I have a topic for a great companion piece that you could recommend, both that older episode and the new episode on this general topic. And that's great because it illustrates that they actually did do some research. They did look into, what my podcast was about. They actually looked through back episodes and looked for topics that would make sense and understood the relationship of what they were pitching to what I had done before. So making it easy, making it specific, I think those are the key tips. I would ask
Yeah.
you too, like what is a compelling pitch for you for Stark Reflections?
Well, I would dig into that a little bit deeper because I can get some crafty people who can fake it really well, and then when you actually fall for it, because I have, you realize that they're just making it up, and it was kind of like a horoscope. It can apply to 5 billion people. It's
Yeah.
so vague, you know.
I love what you're doing so
Yeah.
much. I
You will
got one of
breathe
those.
in and out later today. Oh my God, they were just true, right? I did breathe in and out.
Yeah, I got
So
one of those generic things once that said, I just found your last episode so compelling. And I wrote back and I said, in what way? And I never heard of it from that
yeah,
person
yeah,
again.
what specific, and that would be like not just the that you did this topic, but so and so in the episode talked about this, and I
Yes.
have a further illustration of that.
Yes,
But from a different perspective, I'd love to be able to share with your listeners. I mean, that
exactly.
indicates they actually listen to the conversation and they want to be part of the community
Yeah,
and they want to connect with your audience. There, see, I used all three C's.
you did.
But you reminded me of something that's so important. And again, I'll go back to ALA last week. I don't know for sure what the future episodes are going to be. I've got about 20 interviews in the queue already, and I only release one a week. So that means, whoo, it's going to be a while. Now, I do sneak stuff in early, depending on what's going on in the world or my timeline or thematically. But I came back from this conference. I met people. I had conversations with librarians. I had conversations with authors. I had conversations with service providers in the book industry. And it was so funny because in the middle of that organic conversation, I went, "Oh, would you be willing to come on my podcast and talk?"
Yes, exactly.
I had no idea I wanted to talk about this until I was in a really engaging conversation and I went, ding, ding, ding. I think my listeners would value because I value this, right?
Yes.
That happens
Yes.
so much more often than we actually expect, right?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, at least half of the guests I've had on the podcast have come from that very thing, a conversation or going to a writer's conference and listening to someone give a talk and think.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, I don't want them to just come on the podcast and regurgitate what they said at the conference, but sometimes they'll say like one thing that fascinates
Yes.
me, and they don't have time in that presentation to delve into it. And I'll get in touch with them and say, I was really fascinated by this one reference you made in your talk. Can you come on the podcast and talk about that?
Yeah.
And I think that that's another good illustration of this idea of connections, that oftentimes it's the connections within your own writer community. That if you're attending those conferences, if you're a member of a writers group, if you're engaging in that way, then those kind of serendipitous opportunities are more likely to come your way.
I think they really do. They really do. So, Maddie, as we go to wrap up, can you please share with my listeners where they can find you, your podcast, and this great book online?
Yes, well, they can find my nonfiction work at theindyauthor.com. That's indie with a Y, INDY. If they're interested in my fiction work, I'm at mattydalrymple.com, and that's Matty with a Y, Matty. And they can find the Podcast Guest Playbook, Turning Conversations into Connections and Community, on all fine major online retailers.
Awesome. And there'll be links to that in the show notes. So, last question, Maddie, and this is just in general. When you think back to your beginnings as a writer or as a podcaster or both, some sort of advice that you would offer back to Matty Dalrymple, who was just getting into this. Maybe it's a warning about what you were getting into. Maybe it's some advice that you wish someone had shared with you.
Well, I think that that service theme really extends to this question as well, because I look back to when I'd written my first novel and I was trying to get it out there. And I'm sure I was guilty of the buy my book, buy my book, buy my book approach to marketing and promotion, which is not really recommended. Um, and I think that that focus on building the relationships early on, rather than a focus on that single book, would have benefited me. I think that many indie authors are multi-book authors, whether that's like a series of fiction or a series of nonfiction, and that your time is better spent building that community than it is waving your book in front of somebody and saying, buy my book.
I love that. Great words of wisdom to end the podcast on. Matty, thanks again for hanging out with me.
Thanks, Mark. It is always so much fun.
So a few things to reflect on. The first is the reminder of Matty adding value. So talking about the podcast, the Pod Pro consulting that she does. And this just happened on the spur of the moment. As we're talking, I'm like, hey, I'd love to pay you for this. And then Matty says, no, I'm going to give it to you complimentary. So that is complimentary of Matty. And thank you so much, Matty. So for my patrons, I'm going to have a form, very simple form, your name, your email address. Yes, I'm interested. Sign me up. Put me in, coach. I'm ready to play today. Sorry, baseball reference. By the way, Blue Jays in the World Series. Yay! They haven't been there since, 92, 93? They were the champions. And I'm not a sports fan, but I did quite enjoy having a beer, watching a couple of the Jays games with a couple different friends in Ottawa. That was very, very exciting. I didn't even watch Game 7 because I was at home and I went to bed early. But there's nothing like watching, I'm not a sports guy, but there's nothing like having a beer and watching a team where everyone in the bar is cheering for, so that's always fun. I also distracted myself and went on a complete tangent. That never happens to me. But back to the matter at hand, you can fill out the form as a patron and just say, yes, put me in, coach. That's what got me on the sidetrack. Put me in, I'm interested, and I'll do a random draw so that you can benefit from that awesome coaching with Matty about podcasts. So thank you to all my patrons, of course, for supporting this podcast at patreon.com/darkreflections, as well as my coffee buddies over at buymeacoffee.com/Mark Leslie. This is just, these kinds of extra bonuses are ways to thank you for thanking me, for helping me as well. And Matty's playing a great role in that. So that will be, there'll be a link to that over on Patreon by Friday as this episode comes out. But also, the other thing I wanted to reflect on was, so in our conversation, I spoke about how the pitches are able to fake actually knowing something about the podcast, or based on the prevalence. Like I probably get a half a dozen of them a day now. The prevalence of fake emails from folks looking for you to pay them for a promo that do a really excellent job. They're likely leveraging some sort of AI, but they're making it look like as if they're familiar with or have read your book. And so I thought I would share with you because I thought it would be pertinent, as I think I took some screenshots here. So here's one. For example, this just killed me, and it's very funny. I was going to share this socially. And I got this email from StephenKing1240@gmail.com. And it was in my spam folder when I was looking for something else. Hi, I'm Stephen King, author of books like The Shining, It, and The Outsider. I write about the strange, the dark, and the deeply human, stories that explore fear, courage, and the shadows we all carry inside us. Here's one of my books, link I shall never click, and my Amazon page, which looks like it is an Amazon page, but I ain't ever clicking any of those links. Sorry. I've always loved connecting with readers and writers who are passionate about storytelling that hits the heart of and the nerves alike. I'd love to hear what draws you to create and what stories keep you awake at night. Best, Stephen King. Well, I can 100% guarantee you that is not Stephen King, that is some sort of scam, but I just think it's so cute. It's like, oh boy, Stephen King's going to email me out of the blue. Like, yeah, right, buddy. Anyways, but here's another one. This one was relatively well done. Okay, so this was, the subject line was helping more readers discover Hex in the city. And this is from, I'm not even going to mention their name. Hello, Mark. I'm X, an advocate who helps authors connect their stories with passionate book clubs that turn casual readers into lasting fans, reviewers, and supporters. When I came across Hex in the City, I was immediately drawn to its heart, the balance of love, destiny, and danger that runs through Michael and Gail's story. It's not just a paranormal adventure, it's a deeply human tale about choosing love even when the world seems to be falling apart. That emotional honesty is exactly what stays with readers and sparks conversation long after the final page. That's why I'd love to create a tailored book club promotion for Hex in the City. My focus is helping stories like yours reach the kind of readers who don't just read, they discuss, share, and champion books they connect with. Here's how this helps your work stand out. Blah, 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 blah. If this sounds like something you'd be interested in exploring, I'd love to share how the process works and what it could look like for Hex in the City. Your series already has the heart and imagination readers love. Let's make sure even more of them find it, discuss it, and fall in love with it. Warm regards, my name, author, advocate, book club specialist. Sorry, I'll have to bleep that out. I thought I'd read it because, I'll be honest with you, very, very honest with you, reading anything that says anything positive about your work really strikes you in the deepest, most profound ways. And what really hurts me when I read something like this, because I know how desperate I am and how starved I am for love and attention and affection, and somebody just to pat me on the head and say, "Oh, you're good, you're writing good." It's easy to fall prey to something like that, and it's really well done. And I'm pretty sure that this is a scammer who's just going to bilk writers for a lot of money. And what really breaks my heart is that, I mean, God, even just reading it there, I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. This does have this heart, and this does have this, right? Like, we love hearing, we're all narcissistic in at least a small way. We love hearing how amazing we are. That never gets old. So it feeds something in us. It stokes that part of our ego that we're so desperately we crave. And then honestly, I get a lot of these a day, and I only usually find them when I'm looking in my spam folder for other things. Fortunately, Gmail's smart enough to recognize the scam artists. But honestly, I mean, it looks like, oh my God, yeah, of course I want a readers club to read my book and talk about. My book's amazing. Everyone should read my book. We'll all have fun if you read my book, right? So that's why I got so angry, because it's so well done, and they're getting better. They're getting better at tricking authors, and that's what really annoys me. That's what really disturbs me, especially because I know just how desperately I need it. And I'm sure most other writers need it. So anyways, this is in relation to, like, this is a pitch, right? It's not a pitch for a podcast that Matty and I talk about, but as we were talking about it, I kept going, yeah, and since June, when we had that conversation, the technology has gotten so much better that you can quickly and easily learn some high-level things about a book without ever having to touch it yourself, and make it look like you've read the book and you understand what it's all about. So my reflection here is, yes, attend to the awesome advice that Matty gave in terms of the things that you pitch, but also the other reflection is attend to the things that come in to you as an author, even if you're not hosting a podcast or whatever, and be very, very skeptical. And I hate saying that because I'm an optimistic person, but be very skeptical. Like, why are they reaching out? Why would Stephen King email me? Why would somebody be reaching out? It's because this is a way that they make money. And again, everyone's got to make money, but I just don't like the deceptive practice. And I guess there was another reflection in there that was kind of related to this, and it goes back to Matty's advice, and it goes back to the advice we give in the book. As the proliferation of digital slush gets really good and looks yummy and delicious, think about the things that you, very specifically you, the human, can talk about, can share, can offer, that, again, to borrow that phrase from Joanna Penn, as I often do, double down on your humanity. So vital, so very important. I strongly encourage you to continue to do that and check that out as much as humanly possible, because That's the way you're going to stand against some of the machines. Now, I'm a big fan of leveraging the machines and levering the digital technology to make our lives easier as authors, not to scam people or mislead them, but to help us. I mean, I will often use digital content in my initial research to at least get the ideas of where am I going to go? What are the things I need to look into? And then, okay, great, I got my bullet list. Now I can dig into that. I can get into the library. I can find these articles. I can find actual content about this, but it can help provide some amazing leads. So that saves me some of that time as well. So again, I'm a huge fan of leveraging the tools, but I'm also a huge fan of this human leveraging the tools in ways that only I can leverage the tools, because somebody else using the exact same tool is going to do it in a different way. And that's their voice. That's the way that they do things. So doubling down on that, focusing on you and the value that you bring to this particular equation is so critical, so important. And that's kind of that final reflection that I got from this conversation. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, I'd appreciate you leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because those help out. Leave comments as well. That also helps, because it shows that people are engaged, which is always good and makes me feel good too, because, hey, we always want to feel good, don't we? But also, thank you. A huge thank you so much for listening. If you think that there's someone else out there that would get benefit from this episode or any of the episodes, I'd greatly appreciate if you just did them that favor, and me that favor, and you that favor to say, hey, you should check this out. I thought it was kind of cool. Because everyone wins when you do that. Oh, it's so giving, it's so caring, it's so lovely. But as I get silly and a little bit tired, and I'm hoping that there's a little bit more coffee that's still warm on the machine downstairs, I'm going to bid you, my dear listener, adieu. That's French for goodbye, I think. Yeah, that's what it is. I am partially, microscopically bilingual, let's say. I know a few words, but I want to bid you adieu. And thank you so much for listening. Until next week and until next episode, this is Monsieur Mark Leslie Lefebvre wishing you great écrivain, or great writing. So I'm not even going to try. A great writing and good Stark reflections, or should I say réflexion. Talk to you later.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.